Sometimes the kindest souls are the ones the world overlooks, and the greatest acts of love are the ones no one ever sees. In the harsh desert of New Mexico territory, a lonely cowboy named Elias Boone and his donkey Daisy found an old woman named Martha, abandoned in a cabin and left to die alone. Elias stayed with her, gave her food and warmth, and filled her last days with companionship. Then one spring morning he rode away and never returned. 10 years passed. The story faded into whisper and legend. Then a stranger in a fine coat arrived at that weathered cabin. Inside he found a simple grave, a patient donkey, and a letter on the table. The words revealed a truth that would break his heart. Elias had spent those 10 years searching for Martha's lost son, and now that son had finally come home. What was written in that letter, and why did Elias sacrifice everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carried dust devils across the high desert plains the day Elias Boone first saw the cabin. It was late September of 1883, and the sun hung low and orange over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, painting the scrubland in shades of copper and rust. Elias had been drifting through New Mexico territory for the better part of 3 months, taking odd jobs where he could find them, sleeping under stars more often than roofs. He was a man of 32 years, though the sun and wind had carved lines into his face that made him look older. His clothes were worn but clean, his hat shaped by weather and time into something uniquely his own. Beside him walked Daisy, a gray donkey he'd acquired 5 years prior from a rancher in Texas who could no longer feed her. She was small and sturdy, with patient brown eyes and ears that swiveled to catch every sound across the empty land. Elias talked to her sometimes, though he rarely spoke to people. She listened without judgment, carried his few possessions without complaint, and had become the only constant companion in a life defined by movement and solitude. The dust storm had come up sudden, as they often did in that country. One moment the air was clear enough to see for miles. The next it was thick with grit that stung the eyes and filled the mouth with the taste of alkali. Elias had pulled his bandana over his nose and squinted against the onslaught, searching for any kind of shelter. That was when he'd spotted the cabin, a dark shape emerging from the brown haze like a ship from fog. It sat alone in a shallow valley, backed against a stand of cottonwoods that suggested water nearby. The structure was small, maybe 2 rooms, with a porch that sagged on one end and a chimney made of river stones. No smoke rose from that chimney. No horse stood in the lean-to beside the cabin. The place had the look of abandonment about it, the kind of silence that settles over buildings when people stop living in them. Elias approached cautiously, one hand on Daisy's halter. The wind howled around them, driving sand against the weathered boards. The door stood slightly ajar, moving in the gusts, hinges creaking. He called out, but his voice was lost in the storm. He tied Daisy to a porch post in the lee of the wind and pushed the door open wider. The smell hit him first. Not death, thank mercies, but neglect. Stale air, unwashed cloth, the sour tang of desperation. The single room was dim, lit only by what little light penetrated the dust-caked windows. A table, 2 chairs, a cold stove, a narrow bed against the far wall, and in that bed, a shape so still he thought for a moment it might be nothing but bundled blankets. Then it moved. Elias stepped closer, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. An old woman lay there, her white hair spread across a thin pillow, her face gaunt and pale as candle wax. Her eyes were open but unfocused, staring at the ceiling. Her lips moved slightly, forming words without sound. "Ma'am?" Elias said softly. Her eyes shifted toward him, but there was no recognition in them, no understanding. Just a vast emptiness that made his chest tighten. He looked around the cabin with new eyes. The cupboards stood open, bare shelves visible inside. No firewood by the stove. A bucket near the door held perhaps an inch of stagnant water. On the table sat a kerosene lamp with no oil, and beside it a worn leather Bible. Elias felt something cold settle in his stomach. Someone had left this woman here to die. He moved to the bed and knelt beside it. Up close, he could see how thin she was, how her collarbones pressed sharp against papery skin. Her dress hung loose on a frame that had once been fuller. Her hands, folded on her chest, were all bone and tendon. "Ma'am," he said again, reaching out to touch her shoulder gently. "Can you hear me?" This time her eyes found his face. For a long moment she stared at him, and then tears began to slide down her temples into her hair. "Thomas?" Her voice was a dry whisper, cracked and uncertain. "Thomas, you came back." Elias's throat tightened. "No, ma'am." "My name's Elias Boone. I'm just passing through, taking shelter from the storm," but she didn't seem to hear him. Her skeletal hand reached up and grasped his sleeve with surprising strength. "I knew you'd come. I knew you wouldn't leave me here forever." He didn't correct her again. Instead, he said, "When did you last eat, ma'am?" Her brow furrowed, confusion crossing her face. "Eat? I don't. The supplies ran out. Thomas said he'd send more, but—" Her voice trailed off, eyes losing focus again. Elias stood and went to his pack by the door. He had jerky, some hardtack, half a canteen of water. Not much, but it was something. He poured water into a tin cup and brought it to her lips. She drank eagerly, desperately, water running down her chin. He had to pull the cup away before she made herself sick. "Easy now," he said. "Small sips. We'll get more in you soon enough." He broke off a small piece of hardtack, softened it in water, and fed it to her bit by bit. She ate like someone who'd forgotten what food was, tears still streaming from her eyes. Outside, the storm continued to rage. Inside, Elias worked methodically. He found the well behind the cabin, still good, and hauled up fresh water. He located a small store of wood under a tarp behind the lean-to and built a fire in the stove. He made thin broth from jerky and water, fed her slowly, watched her eyes begin to clear. "What's your name, ma'am?" he asked as the cabin warmed. "Martha," she whispered. "Martha Greeley. Where's your family, Miss Martha?" Her face crumpled. Gone to California. Said they'd come back for me. Said they'd send supplies." Fresh tears came. "That was, I don't know how long ago. The food ran out. The water got low. I couldn't walk to town, too far. Too weak." Elias felt anger kindle in his chest, hot and steady. What kind of people left an old woman to starve alone? "How far to town?" he asked. 5 miles. Copper Springs." She looked at him with sudden clarity, seeing him properly for the first time. "You're not Thomas?" "No, ma'am. I'm Elias Boone. And this is Daisy." He gestured toward the door, where the donkey could be heard shifting on the porch, sheltering from the wind. Something like a smile touched Martha's lips. "A donkey?" "Yes, ma'am." "She's good company." Martha closed her eyes. "Better than no company at all." The storm blew itself out as evening came on. Elias brought Daisy into the cabin's second room, a small space that might once have been for storage. He found some old hay in the lean-to and made her comfortable. When he returned to the main room, Martha was asleep, her breathing steadier than it had been. Elias sat at the table and opened the Bible. Inside the front cover, written in faded ink, were names and dates. Martha Greeley, born 1820. Married to James Greeley, 1838. One child, Thomas James Greeley, born 1841. He did the arithmetic. Martha was 63 years old. Her son would be 42, old enough to know better than to abandon his mother. Elias closed the Bible and looked around the cabin. The place had good bones. The walls were sound, the roof solid except for one section that needed patching. The windows could be cleaned, the floor swept. With some care, it could be comfortable again. He told himself he'd stay just until she was stronger, just until he was sure she wouldn't die alone in this forgotten place. A few days, maybe a week. Then he'd move on, as he always did. But as he watched the firelight play across Martha's sleeping face, watched the tiny smile that curved her lips as she dreamed, something shifted in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in years, not since his own mother had passed, when he was barely grown. Purpose. Daisy made a soft sound from the other room, a gentle bray that seemed almost like a question. Elias smiled faintly. "I know, girl," he said quietly. "I know." Outside, the stars emerged from the clearing dust, sharp and bright in the clean desert air. Inside the cabin, warmth and light pushed back the darkness. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Elias Boone felt like he might be exactly where he was supposed to be. He settled into the second chair, tipped his hat over his eyes, and let the sound of Martha's steady breathing lull him toward sleep. Tomorrow he'd ride to Copper Springs for proper supplies. Tomorrow he'd start fixing what was broken. Tomorrow, but tonight at least, Martha Greeley wasn't alone anymore. 3 months had passed since that dust-choked September day, and the cabin had transformed in ways that seemed almost miraculous. The roof no longer leaked when the rains came. The windows gleamed clean, letting in the pale November light. The cupboards held flour, cornmeal, dried beans, and preserves. A cord of split wood stood stacked against the outer wall, ready for winter. The floors had been swept and scrubbed until the old planks shone. Martha Greeley had transformed too. The hollow-eyed wraith Elias had found that first day was gone, replaced by a woman who moved with purpose, who smiled readily, who hummed old hymns as she worked at simple tasks. Her cheeks had filled out, color had returned to her skin, and her eyes held light again. She still tired easily, still needed help with the heavier chores, but she was alive in a way she hadn't been for a very long time. Elias had fallen into rhythms he'd never expected to know. Morning chores, water from the well, wood for the stove, feed for Daisy, breakfast with Martha, often just porridge or johnny cakes, but eaten in companionable silence or easy conversation. Then the work of the day, repairs, improvements, or the weekly ride to Copper Springs for supplies. Evenings were for simple pleasures, Martha reading aloud from her Bible or from the few books Elias had brought back from town, the two of them playing cards by lamplight, or just sitting in comfortable quiet as the fire burned low. Daisy had become Martha's shadow. The old donkey would stand at the window looking in, or rest her head on the porch rail where Martha sat in her rocking chair when the weather was mild. Sometimes Martha would feed her apple cores or carrot ends, stroking the soft grey nose and whispering things Elias couldn't hear. The donkey seemed to understand that this frail human needed gentleness, and she gave it freely. The town of Copper Springs had taken notice. 5 miles wasn't far enough to hide anything in country where neighbors were scarce and gossip was currency. At first, there had been suspicion. Samuel Hewitt, who ran both the general store and the small bank, had questioned Elias outright on his second visit to town. "What's your business with the Greeley woman?" Hewitt had asked, his eyes narrow above his substantial mustache. He was a thick-set man in his 50s, prosperously dressed for a frontier shopkeeper, with a gold watch chain across his vest. "Helping her," Elias had replied simply. "Loading supplies into his saddlebags. Helping yourself to her property, more like," Hewitt had suggested, his tone implying all manner of unsavory motives. Elias had turned slowly, his blue eyes cold. "The woman was dying, abandoned, left to starve. I gave her food and water and fixed her roof. If that offends your sensibilities, Mr. Hewitt, I don't know what to tell you." Hewitt had backed down, but the suspicion had remained in his eyes. Over the following weeks, as Elias continued to make his supply runs, the questions had persisted. Who was he? Where did he come from? What did he want? Elias answered when he had to, but mostly he kept his own counsel. His past was his own business, and his present was simple enough. He was helping someone who needed help. Not everyone in Copper Springs shared Hewitt's suspicions. Reverend Josiah Pike, a lean man with kind eyes and a shock of white hair, had approached Elias in the street one day in late October. "Mr. Boone, isn't it?" the Reverend had said, extending his hand. "I've heard about your kindness to Martha Greeley. It's Christian charity of the highest order." Elias had shaken his hand, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just doing what needs doing, Reverend. Would that more of us thought that way?" Pike had replied. "I tried to check on her several times after her son left, but she wouldn't open the door. I'm ashamed to say I didn't persist as I should have. She thought you'd come to confirm she was dying," Elias had said. "Folks coming around made it more real." Pike had nodded sadly. "Pride and fear make poor companions. I'm glad you found her when you did. Through the Reverend, more of Martha's story had emerged. Her husband, James, had died 12 years ago in a mine collapse, leaving her with little but the cabin and a few acres. She'd raised their son Thomas alone, taking in washing and mending to make ends meet. Thomas had been a bright boy, ambitious, hungry for more than the hard scrabble life Copper Springs offered. He'd gone to Santa Fe at 18, found work as a clerk, and slowly built himself up. Then, 5 years ago, he'd come back to Copper Springs dressed in fine clothes with a beautiful woman on his arm. Victoria was her name, from a wealthy San Francisco family. They were heading to California, Thomas had explained. He'd made arrangements for his mother to be cared for. Supplies would be sent, money would come. They'd send for her once they were settled. The supplies had come for a while. Then they'd stopped. No word, no explanation. Martha had waited, too proud to ask for help, too hopeful to believe she'd truly been forgotten. She'd lived on what she had, then on what she could grow, then on nothing at all. The story had made Elias's jaw tighten, but he'd said nothing. Judgment was easy. Understanding was harder. He didn't know Thomas Greeley's side of things, didn't know what pressures or promises might have pulled him away. But the result was the same. Martha had been left to die alone. Now, in mid-November, with winter beginning to settle over the high desert, Martha had something to show Elias. She'd been quiet all morning, nervous in a way he hadn't seen before. After their midday meal, she went to a small trunk at the foot of her bed and drew out something wrapped in cloth. "I want you to see this," she said, returning to the table where Elias sat mending a bridle. Her hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped the cloth. It was a photograph, or what remained of one. A tintype, damaged by water and time, the image faded but still visible. A young man in his 20s, serious-faced and formally dressed, stared out from the silvered surface. He had Martha's eyes, Elias realized. The same shape, the same intensity. "Thomas," Martha said softly, touching the image with one finger. This was taken in Santa Fe, just before he went to California. "He sent it to me with a letter. Said he wanted me to remember him as he was then. Successful, respectable," her voice caught. "He was so proud." Elias studied the photograph. The young man looked confident, his shoulders squared, his chin lifted. But there was something in his eyes, something that might have been uncertainty or fear, hidden beneath the pride. "Tell me about him," Elias said gently. Martha sank into her chair, still holding the photograph. "He was a good boy. Bright. He learned to read before any of the other children, did arithmetic in his head, faster than the teacher could write problems on the slate. James used to say Thomas would go far, that he had the mind for it." She smiled, but it was edged with sorrow. Maybe that was the problem. This place was never going to be enough for him. "Nothing wrong with ambition," Elias offered. "No," Martha agreed. "But there's something wrong with forgetting where you came from. Who raised you? Who sacrificed for you?" She set the photograph on the table between them. "His wife, Victoria, she came from money. Old California money, from before the war. I could see it in her face when Thomas brought her here, the way she looked at this cabin, at me, at the whole town. Like we were something dirty she had to step over. She say something to you. Didn't have to. I could see it plain enough. And I could see Thomas seeing me through her eyes. Suddenly I wasn't his mother anymore. I was embarrassment, evidence of the poverty he'd clawed his way out of." Martha's voice stayed steady, but tears slipped down her weathered cheeks. "He hugged me goodbye, told me he'd send for me soon. But I knew I'd never see him again." Elias reached across the table and took her hand. "It felt like bird bones wrapped in parchment. Did he write?" he asked. Martha nodded. "Once, 3 years ago." She drew a folded paper from her apron pocket, worn soft from handling. "Here," Elias unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting was neat, educated, but the words were cold. "Mother, I hope this letter finds you well. Victoria and I are settled in San Francisco now. I have a position with a banking firm, and we have a fine home in a respectable neighborhood. We are quite busy with social obligations and the demands of my work. I trust the arrangements I made for your care continue to serve. If you require anything, please write to the address below, and I will endeavor to respond. Your son, Thomas J. Greeley. There was no warmth in it, no affection. It read like a business correspondence, formal and distant. Elias folded it back up and handed it to Martha. "Did you write back?" he asked. "A dozen times," Martha said. Told him about the cabin, about the garden, about what was happening in town. Asked about his life, whether he was happy, whether he'd started a family. Begged him to visit, or to send for me like he'd promised. She tucked the letter back in her pocket. Never got a reply. After a while, the letters started coming back marked unknown. Either he'd moved and didn't tell me, or he was telling the postal service he didn't know anyone by my name. The pain in her voice was raw, and Elias felt his anger toward Thomas Greeley solidify into something harder. But he kept his voice gentle. "What would you say to him now if you could?" Martha was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photograph of her son. "I'd tell him I forgive him," she said finally. "I'd tell him I understand that sometimes we make choices that seem right at the time, but cost us more than we realize. I'd tell him I love him, that I always will, no matter what." She looked up at Elias, her eyes bright with tears. "And I'd tell him that I just want to know he's all right, that he's happy, that his life turned out the way he hoped. That's all. I don't need him to come back. I don't need him to apologize. I just need to know he's living well." Something shifted in Elias's chest, a decision forming that he didn't entirely understand yet. He looked at the photograph again, memorizing the features of Thomas Greeley's face, the proud set of his jaw, the faint worry line between his brows, the way he held himself, like a man trying to prove something. "You're a better person than most, Miss Martha," Elias said quietly. She shook her head. "I'm just a mother who loves her son. That doesn't make me special. It just makes me human." That evening, after Martha had gone to bed, Elias sat at the table with the photograph before him. He'd borrowed it, told Martha he wanted to study it by better light. She'd let him take it with a curious look, but she trusted him now, and she didn't question. By lamplight, he studied every detail of Thomas Greeley's face. Then he opened the small leather journal he'd purchased in town weeks ago, the one he'd been using to record his thoughts and the work he'd done on the cabin. On a fresh page, he began to write, "Thomas James Greeley, born 1841, Copper Springs, New Mexico Territory, last known address, San Francisco, California. Mother, Martha Greeley, aged 63, living alone 5 miles from Copper Springs. Abandoned approximately 5 years ago." He paused, pen hovering over paper. Then he wrote one more line, "Must be found." Outside, Daisy shifted in her shelter, a soft sound in the darkness. The wind moved through the cottonwoods, carrying the first sharp bite of winter. And in his narrow bed in the lean-to where he'd made his quarters, Elias Boone lay awake for hours, staring at the rough wooden beams above him. He'd never had much use for plans. His life had been defined by drifting, by taking each day as it came, by owing nothing to anyone and expecting nothing in return. But something had changed in these 3 months. Martha had given him purpose without asking for anything. She'd trusted him without reason. She'd reminded him that kindness existed, that people could be decent, that there was worth in simply helping someone who needed help. And now she'd shown him her deepest wound, the son who'd abandoned her. And all she wanted was to know he was well. Elias couldn't give her back the years she'd lost. He couldn't make Thomas Greeley into a better man. But maybe, just maybe, he could give her that one small thing, the knowledge that her son was alive and well. The idea was crazy. San Francisco was more than 1,000 miles away. He had no money to speak of, no contacts, no experience tracking people. He was a drifter, a ranch hand, a man who knew horses and cattle and hard work, not the intricacies of finding someone who didn't want to be found. But he also knew stubbornness. He knew persistence. And he knew that once he set his mind to something, he didn't quit easy. He'd need to prepare. He'd need to make sure Martha would be cared for while he was gone. He'd need supplies, information, a plan. It might take months. It might take years. It might be impossible. But as sleep finally took him in the cold hours before dawn, Elias Boone had already made his decision. He would find Thomas Greeley. He would look the man in the eyes and tell him what his mother had suffered. And he would bring back word to Martha that her son was well. even if it was the last thing he ever did. In the main cabin, Martha slept peacefully, unaware of the promise taking shape in the heart of the man who'd saved her life. And on the table, the photograph of Thomas Greeley stared into the darkness, his expression frozen in time. Pride and worry mingled in his youthful face. The photograph that would guide Elias on a journey that would consume the next decade of his life. Winter settled over the high desert like a benediction. The cottonwoods shed their leaves, standing skeletal against skies that shifted from brilliant blue to heavy gray and back again. Snow came in fits and starts, never deep enough to trap them, but persistent enough to transform the landscape into something hushed and otherworldly. Inside the cabin, warmth and routine made the cold months almost pleasant. Elias and Martha had fallen into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Mornings began with Elias building up the fire while Martha prepared breakfast. They ate together, talking about small things. The weather, the condition of the wood supply, whether Daisy seemed to be favoring her left rear hoof. After breakfast, Elias would tend to the outdoor chores, while Martha worked inside, mending clothes or preparing their midday meal. She still tired easily, but each week brought small improvements in her strength. The afternoons were different. Martha had discovered that Elias, for all his practical skills, had only rudimentary reading ability. He could puzzle out simple words, but anything more complex left him frustrated. She'd noticed him struggling with a newspaper he'd brought back from town, his finger tracing under words, his lips moving silently. "Elias," she'd said that first time, "would you like some help with that?" He'd looked up, embarrassment coloring his weathered face. "Never had much schooling. Learned enough to get by, but sit down," she'd said firmly, pulling a chair close to hers. "We'll work on it together." And so their afternoons had become lessons. Martha was a patient teacher, and Elias proved a determined student. They started with simple passages from her Bible, moved on to newspapers, and eventually to the few books that had accumulated in the cabin over the years. Slowly, haltingly, Elias's reading improved. He began to recognize words without sounding them out, to understand sentences on the first pass rather than the third. In return, Elias taught Martha things he'd learned in his years of drifting: how to read weather in the way clouds gathered over the mountains, how to tell if a horse was sound by the way it moved, card games he'd picked up in bunkhouses and saloons, poker, monte, even a few tricks for cheating that made Martha laugh and scold him in equal measure. "You're a terrible influence. Elias Boone," she'd say, but her eyes would sparkle with amusement. "Yes, ma'am," he'd reply with a small smile. "But I'm an honest, terrible influence." Daisy, meanwhile, had become Martha's constant companion. The old donkey had taken to sleeping in the second room of the cabin, close enough that Martha could hear her gentle breathing through the thin wall. When Martha sat on the porch during the rare warm afternoons, wrapped in blankets, Daisy would rest her head on the railing beside her. Sometimes Martha would sing old songs, her voice thin but sweet, and Daisy's ears would swivel toward her as if the donkey understood every word. The arrangement had not gone unnoticed in Copper Springs. On Elias's weekly trips to town, he'd become the subject of increasing speculation. Some of it was kind, some less so. But gradually, as weeks turned to months and no scandal emerged, the town's attitude had begun to shift. The turning point had come in early December, when a young widow named Clara Bennett had approached Elias outside the general store. She was perhaps 30, with dark hair and tired eyes, carrying a basket covered with a cloth. "Mr. Boone," she'd said, her voice hesitant, "I hope you don't think me forward, but I wanted to bring these to Mrs. Greeley." She'd pulled back the cloth to reveal jars of preserves: peach, strawberry, apple butter. I remember her from before. She was kind to me when my husband passed. I heard she was doing poorly, and I wanted to help. Elias had taken the basket, touched by the gesture. "That's real kind of you, Mrs. Bennett. Martha will appreciate it." "How is she?" Clara had asked. "Truly?" "Better," Elias had said. "Stronger. She smiles now, laughs even." Tears had sprung to Clara's eyes. "I'm so glad. We all thought when we heard she'd been left alone. Some of us tried to check on her, but she wouldn't answer the door. We should have tried harder. You're trying now, Elias had said gently. That counts for something. After that, Clara had become a regular visitor to the cabin. She'd ride out once or twice a week, sometimes bringing food, sometimes just bringing company. She and Martha would sit for hours, talking about everything and nothing. Clara had lost her husband to cholera 3 years prior, and she understood the particular loneliness of being left behind. The two women formed a bond that seemed to heal something in both of them. Through Clara, Elias learned more about the community's feelings toward Martha's situation. Most people had assumed Thomas was sending money, that Martha was choosing to live simply. When the truth emerged, that she'd been completely abandoned, sympathy had replaced judgment. But by then it had been too late. Martha had retreated into herself, and Elias had arrived before anyone else could reach her. It was also through Clara that Elias began to learn about the mechanics of finding a missing person. Her late husband had worked for a freight company, and she knew people who moved across territories. One afternoon in late December, she'd brought Reverend Pike with her to the cabin. Pike had been warmly received by Martha, and after pleasantries were exchanged over coffee, the conversation had turned serious. "Clara tells me you're interested in learning how to track someone down," Pike had said to Elias. "Someone who doesn't want to be found." Elias had glanced at Martha, who was showing Clara her small collection of pressed flowers. "Might be," he'd said carefully. Pike had smiled knowingly. "I spent some years as a missionary in the Western Territories before I took this parish. I encountered more than a few people who'd reinvented themselves, left their pasts behind. I learned a few things about how they did it, and how they could be found if someone was determined enough." "I'm listening," Elias had said. "First thing you need to understand," Pike had said, "is that finding someone takes time and money. You follow paper trails, property records, business licenses, newspaper announcements. You talk to people, postal clerks, hotel registers, church congregations. You're looking for connections, for patterns. One lead might take you nowhere, but 10 leads might start to show a picture." "Sounds complicated," Elias had said. "It is. But it's not impossible." Pike had leaned forward, his voice dropping. "There's a man in Santa Fe, name of Augustus Cole, former Pinkerton agent. He's retired now, but he still takes on cases occasionally. If you were serious about finding someone, he could teach you what you'd need to know." Elias had absorbed this information in silence. Santa Fe was 3 days' ride from Copper Springs. Augustus Cole was a name, a possibility, a thread he could pull. That night after their visitors had left and Martha had retired to bed, Elias had sat at the table with his journal. He'd been documenting everything. Martha's stories about Thomas, details from the photograph, information from the cold letter. Now he added Pike's advice, Cole's name, the outline of a plan beginning to take shape. He knew what he was contemplating was madness. Leaving Martha, even with Clara and Pike to check on her, felt like betrayal. Spending months or years searching for a man who'd made it clear he wanted no contact with his past seemed futile. And what if he succeeded? What if he found Thomas Greeley and the man refused to even acknowledge his mother? Would knowing that be worse than not knowing? But when he remembered Martha's face as she'd looked at that photograph, when he recalled her words, "I just need to know he's all right," Elias knew he didn't have a choice. Not really. Martha had given him something he hadn't known he needed, a reason to matter to someone. The least he could do was give her this one thing in return. The practical problems were significant. He needed money for travel, for lodging, for the inevitable expenses of a long search. His savings from odd jobs amounted to perhaps $40, enough for a few weeks on the road, but not much more. He'd need to find work as he traveled, which would slow him down. He'd also need to ensure Martha was provided for in his absence. In early January, when the worst of winter had passed and the roads were passable again, Elias had a frank conversation with Clara and Reverend Pike. They'd come for their regular visit, and Elias had asked them to stay after Martha had gone to rest. "I need to tell you something," he'd said. And I need your help." He'd explained his plan, leaving nothing out. The search for Thomas Greeley, the probable duration, the need for someone to look after Martha while he was gone. Clara had been the first to speak. "You're going to try to find her son?" "Yes, ma'am. That's a considerable undertaking, Mr. Boone," Pike had said thoughtfully. "It could take years, I know. And Mrs. Greeley, have you told her?" "Not yet. Don't plan to, not directly. I'll tell her I need to find work, that I'll be traveling for a while. She doesn't need to know what I'm really doing. If I fail, she'll never have to know I tried." Clara had reached across the table and taken his hand. "You're a good man, Elias Boone, better than most. I'll check on Martha every day if I need to. She won't be alone. I can arrange for supplies to be delivered," Pike had added. "And there are funds in the church discretionary account for exactly this sort of situation. Martha won't want for anything. I'll leave money," Elias had protested. "Everything I've saved. You'll need that for your search," Pike had said firmly. "The church will handle Martha's needs. You just focus on finding her boy." Elias had felt emotion tighten his throat. These people, this community he'd kept at arm's length for months, were stepping forward without hesitation. "I don't know how to thank you. Bring her son home," Clara had said simply. "Or at least bring her news of him. That's thanks enough." The next weeks were spent in preparation. Elias made improvements to the cabin that would last in his absence. A new lock for the door, repairs to the porch rail, a month's worth of wood split and stacked. He took Daisy to the town blacksmith and had her hooves checked, her shoes replaced. The old donkey would stay with Martha, a living reminder that Elias would return. He purchased a small camera from a traveling salesman, learning to use it so he could document his search if needed. He bought a better coat, sturdy boots, a rain slicker. He wrote down everything he knew about Thomas Greeley in meticulous detail, creating a document he could refer to and add to as he learned more. And late at night, when the cabin was dark and quiet, he wrote in his journal, not just facts and plans, but thoughts and fears. What if he failed? What if the search consumed him and he never made it back? What if he found Thomas and the man was cruel, or dismissive, or simply indifferent? But always, he came back to the same conclusion. He had to try. For Martha, for the woman who'd reminded him that kindness existed, that people mattered, that there was purpose in caring for someone beyond yourself. In mid-February, with the first hints of spring beginning to show in the greening cottonwoods, Elias knew it was time. He delayed as long as he reasonably could, making excuses to himself about weather and preparations. But the truth was simpler. He didn't want to leave. He'd found something here in this small cabin with this old woman and this patient donkey. He'd found home of a sort, peace, the kind of contentment he'd never expected to know. Leaving felt like tearing something vital out of his chest, but he was going to do it anyway. The morning he'd chosen to tell Martha, she'd made his favorite breakfast, flapjacks with the last of Clara's strawberry preserves. They'd eaten in comfortable silence, and then Elias had cleared his throat. "Miss Martha, I need to talk to you about something." She'd looked up from her coffee, her eyes immediately concerned. "What is it?" "I need to head out for a while, do some traveling, find work. I've been living on my savings these past months, and they're running low." He hated lying to her, but it was kinder than the truth. If he told her he was searching for Thomas and then failed, it would break her heart twice. Martha's face had fallen. "Oh, of course. I shouldn't have assumed you'd stay forever. You've done so much already." "I'm coming back," Elias had said firmly. "This is just temporary. A few months, maybe longer. But I'll be back. Where will you go?" "West, probably. Maybe north, wherever the work is." He'd reached across the table and taken her hand. "Clara and Reverend Pike will check on you. There's money arranged for supplies. And Daisy will stay with you." "Daisy?" Martha's eyes had filled with tears. "But she's yours." "She's ours," Elias had corrected gently. "And she'd rather be here with you than on the road with me." "You know that's true." Martha had nodded, unable to speak. Then she'd stood, come around the table and embraced him. It was the first time she'd hugged him, and Elias had been surprised by how frail she still felt, how fragile. "Come back safe," she'd whispered. "Please." "I will," he'd promised. I give you my word. 2 days later, on a morning bright with false spring warmth, Elias had packed his few belongings onto a rented horse. His own gear was minimal: clothes, blanket, his journal, the photograph he'd secretly kept of Thomas. He'd said his goodbyes the night before, not trusting himself to do it in the moment, but Martha and Daisy had been on the porch anyway, watching as he'd swung into the saddle. The old donkey had brayed, a mournful sound that echoed across the valley. Martha had raised one hand in farewell, her face composed but her eyes wet. Elias had touched his hat brim to her, not trusting his voice. Then he'd turned the horse east toward Santa Fe, toward Augustus Cole, and the beginning of a search that would consume the next years of his life. He'd looked back once, when he'd reached the top of the ridge. The cabin was small in the distance, smoke rising from the chimney. He could just make out two figures on the porch, a woman and a donkey, both watching him go. Then he'd turned forward and ridden on, carrying Martha's hope with him like a sacred trust. The telegram Elias had sent from Chicago reached Reverend Pike on a cold March morning. Pike had read it twice, absorbing the implications, then immediately went to visit Martha at the cabin. He found her on the porch with Daisy, both of them catching the weak sunshine that promised spring would eventually arrive. "Martha," Pike had said, settling into the chair beside her, "I've had word from Elias. He's coming home." Martha's face had lit up with joy, then immediately clouded with concern. "Is he all right?" "He's not hurt. He's fine. But Martha, there's something you need to know." Pike had explained carefully about the money Thomas had been sending, about Samuel Hewitt's apparent theft, about the investigation that would need to happen. He'd left out the details of Elias's search, his 2-year quest to find Thomas. That was Elias's story to tell if he chose. Martha had listened in silence, her weathered hands gripping the arms of her rocking chair. When Pike finished, she'd sat quietly for a long moment, staring out at the desert landscape. "He was sending money," she'd finally said. "Thomas was sending money?" "Yes, every month, apparently, and that man Hewitt was stealing it. So it appears." Martha had closed her eyes, and tears had slipped down her cheeks. But she was smiling. "He didn't forget me. He didn't abandon me completely. He tried." Pike had taken her hand. "He tried, yes. Though Elias says he won't be coming to visit. I didn't expect him to," Martha had said. "But knowing he thought of me, that he tried to provide for me, that's enough. That's more than I dared hope for." The investigation into Samuel Hewitt had begun even before Elias arrived back in Copper Springs. Pike had contacted the Territorial Marshal's office in Santa Fe, explaining the situation and requesting assistance. The marshal, a capable man named John Reeves, had arrived in town within the week and begun his own discreet inquiries. What he'd found had confirmed Elias's suspicions and revealed something worse. Hewitt hadn't just been stealing from Martha. He'd been embezzling from multiple accounts over a period of years, targeting widows, elderly citizens, and illiterate ranchers who couldn't easily check their balances. The total was in the thousands of dollars. Hewitt's own lifestyle had provided damning evidence. His house was too fine, his clothes too expensive. His wife wore jewelry that shouldn't have been possible on a small-town banker's salary. When pressed, he claimed inheritance from a deceased aunt, but no records of such an inheritance existed. By the time Elias rode into Copper Springs in early April, the case against Hewitt was already building. Elias had gone first to the cabin, had been greeted by Martha with tears and embraces, had spent an evening sharing carefully edited stories of his travels. He'd told her he'd found work in various cities, that he'd learned much and saved little, that he was glad to be home. Martha had looked at him with knowing eyes, but hadn't pressed. "Welcome home, Elias," was all she'd said. The next morning, Elias had met with Marshal Reeves at the church, where Pike kept his office. Reeves was a tall man in his 40s with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Your boon?" he'd asked. "Yes, sir. Pike tells me you've got evidence of theft against Samuel Hewitt." Elias had produced the page from Thomas's ledger, now worn from travel, but still legible. Thomas Greeley's records showing monthly payments to his mother through the Copper Springs Bank. Martha Greeley never received a single dollar of it. Reeves had studied the document. This is good, but it's not enough by itself. Hewitt could claim the payments were delivered, that Mrs. Greeley received them and spent them. Her word against his, and he'll say she's old and confused. There's more, Pike had interjected. I've been keeping Martha's household accounts since Mr. Boone left on his travels. Every expense, every supply purchase. The church was providing her support. If she'd been receiving $50 a month, she wouldn't have needed charity. That helps, Reeves had acknowledged. And I've found evidence of other thefts, but I need to catch him with proof he can't explain away. Documents in his possession, preferably. Or a confession. How do we get that? Elias had asked. We set a trap, Reeves had said. And you're going to be the bait. The plan had been simple but risky. Elias would approach Hewitt directly, claiming to represent Thomas Greeley and demanding an accounting of the funds that were supposed to have been delivered to Martha. Hewitt would likely deny everything but might reveal something in his defensiveness. And while Elias kept him occupied, Reeves and a deputy would search Hewitt's office at the bank for evidence. The risk was that Hewitt might become violent or might simply refuse to engage. But Elias had agreed without hesitation. After 2 years of searching, after confronting Thomas in Chicago, this felt like the final piece of the puzzle. They'd chosen a Thursday afternoon when Hewitt typically worked alone at the bank after closing. Elias had entered through the front door, finding Hewitt at his desk going through papers. We're closed, Hewitt had said without looking up. Then he'd recognized Elias, and his expression had shifted to wariness. Boone, what do you want? I want to talk about Martha Greeley, Elias had said. And the money you've been stealing from her. Hewitt had gone very still. I don't know what you're talking about. Thomas Greeley's been sending $50 a month for 3 years through this bank. Money you were supposed to deliver to his mother. Money she never received. You're mistaken, Hewitt had said, but his hand had moved toward the drawer of his desk. Elias had been faster, crossing the space between them and slamming the drawer shut. Don't! Get out of my bank, Hewitt had snarled, or I'll have you arrested for trespassing. Your bank. Is that what you call it now? The territorial marshal might have different ideas about that. At the mention of the marshal, Hewitt's face had gone pale. What marshal? The one who's been investigating you for weeks. The one who knows about the other accounts you've been stealing from. The one who's probably in your office right now looking through your records. Hewitt had lunged for the back door, but Elias had caught him, the 2 men crashing against the desk. Papers had scattered, an inkwell had overturned. Hewitt was heavier, but Elias was stronger from years of hard labor, and he'd pinned the banker against the wall. Let me go, Hewitt had shouted. Help! Someone help! But the bank was isolated at the edge of town, and no one came. Hewitt had struggled for another moment, then gone limp in Elias's grip. All right, he'd gasped. All right. What do you want? The truth. Where's the money? Hewitt had laughed bitterly. Spent most of it. On this building, on my house, on trying to look successful so people would trust me with more deposits. It's all gone. And the people you stole from? What people? Old widows who don't understand numbers? Ranchers who can't read their own statements? They never even knew the money was missing. The casual cruelty of it, the complete absence of remorse, had made Elias want to drive his fist into Hewitt's smug face. But he'd held back, held on, waited for Marshal Reeves to arrive. Reeves had emerged from the back office moments later, carrying a ledger bound in red leather. Found it, he'd said. Every theft documented in his own hand. Dates, amounts, accounts. He kept records of everything. Pride, Hewitt had muttered. Always wanted to know exactly how much I'd accumulated, how much I'd achieved. He'd been arrested then, along with his brother, the town deputy, who'd been helping him cover his tracks. Both men had been taken to Santa Fe to face territorial charges. The trial, Pike had later told Elias, lasted 3 days. Hewitt had been sentenced to 10 years in prison. His brother got 5. The recovery of the stolen funds had been more complicated. Most of the money was indeed gone, spent on Hewitt's lifestyle and business expenses. But his house, his property, his assets, everything had been seized and liquidated. The proceeds were divided among his victims, proportional to what they'd lost. Martha received $600, a fraction of what Thomas had sent, but more money than she'd seen in years. She'd immediately tried to give half of it to Elias. "You found my boy," she'd said. "You brought justice. This is yours." "I didn't do it for money," Elias had replied. "Then do it for me," Martha had insisted. "Let me repay some small part of what you've given me." He'd accepted $100, knowing she needed to feel like she was contributing, like the relationship between them was one of equals rather than charity. The rest she'd kept, placing it in a new account at a bank in a different town, managed by someone Reverend Pike vouched for personally. In the weeks after Hewitt's arrest, as spring turned the desert green with unexpected rains, life at the cabin had settled into something approaching peace. Martha's health, which had been declining slowly, seemed to stabilize. The knowledge that Thomas had been trying to provide for her, even from a distance, had given her a comfort that showed in her face and bearing. Clara continued her regular visits, bringing news and companionship. Other townspeople, learning the full story of what had happened, began to stop by as well. Martha, who'd been isolated and forgotten, found herself part of a community again, and Elias had finally allowed himself to rest. 2 years of searching, of constant movement and purpose, had worn him down in ways he hadn't fully recognized until he stopped. He slept for nearly 20 hours straight his second night back, waking disoriented and stiff. His body ached in places he'd been ignoring. Grey had crept further into his beard and hair. He was 34 years old, but he felt ancient. One evening, about a month after his return, Martha had asked him to sit with her on the porch. Daisy stood nearby, her grey head hanging low. The old donkey was declining visibly, her movements slow and painful. "Elias," Martha had said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Yes." "Ma'am, where were you really all this time? I know you weren't just looking for work." Elias had considered lying, then decided Martha deserved the truth. "I was looking for Thomas, trying to find him so I could tell him about you, about what happened. So I could bring you word of him." Martha had been quiet, her eyes filling with tears. "For 2 years?" "Yes, ma'am. Why?" "Why would you do that for me?" "Because you asked for so little," Elias had said. "You just wanted to know he was all right. That seemed like something worth giving you. Did you find him?" "I did, in Chicago. He's doing well. Has a wife and children, a good position. He's happy, I think, or as happy as a man like that can be." "And you spoke with him?" "I did. What did he say?" Elias had chosen his words carefully. "He said he was sorry, that he tried to take care of you from a distance because he couldn't do it in person. He said to tell you he's well, that his life turned out like he hoped." It wasn't quite what Thomas had said, but it was what Martha needed to hear. And maybe in its own way, it was true enough. Martha had reached over and taken Elias's hand. "Thank you," she'd whispered. "Thank you for giving me that. For giving me peace." They'd sat in silence as the sun set, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple. Daisy had shifted closer, resting her head against Martha's chair. And for the first time since he'd left the cabin 2 years ago, Elias had felt like he was exactly where he belonged. The letter from Thomas had arrived 3 weeks later, addressed to Elias in care of Reverend Pike. Inside was a shorter letter addressed to Martha, sealed and marked private. Elias had delivered it to her without reading it. Though curiosity had burned in him, Martha had opened it in private, had read it with tears streaming down her face. She'd never told anyone what it said, but afterward she'd seemed lighter somehow. A burden lifted from her shoulders. The letter had been placed in her Bible, tucked between the pages where she'd recorded her family history. And there it would remain, a final communication between mother and son, private and precious. Summer came, hot and dry. Daisy's health continued to decline, until one morning in July, Elias had found her lying in her shelter, breathing shallowly. He'd called for Martha, and together they'd sat with the old donkey as she passed, Martha stroking her soft nose and whispering thanks for years of faithful companionship. They'd buried her on the hill above the cabin, Beside, where Martha had already requested to be laid to rest, Elias had carved a simple marker, Daisy, a true friend. Martha had grieved deeply, the donkey's loss striking her harder than Elias had expected. But she'd also seemed to understand it as a reminder of time's passage, of the inevitable endings that came to all things. "We're all getting old," she'd said as they walked back from the grave. "But we've had good years. Better than I had any right to hope for." Elias had wanted to argue, wanted to say she had many more years ahead. But he'd learned to recognize the truth when he heard it. Martha was preparing herself, making her peace with what was coming, and all he could do was make sure that when the time came, she wouldn't face it alone, just as he'd promised that very first night. When he'd found her half dead in a cold cabin, abandoned and forgotten by the world, she would never be alone again. 3 years passed. 3 years of quiet routine, of small joys and gentle decline. Martha grew frailer despite Elias's care, her steps slower, her breath shorter. But her spirit remained strong, buoyed by the knowledge that her son had thought of her, that justice had been served, that she was valued and loved. Elias stayed. He'd long since stopped thinking of himself as a drifter passing through. The cabin was home now, Martha was family, and Copper Springs had become the first community he'd belonged to since childhood. He worked odd jobs in town, maintained the property, and spent his evenings reading to Martha or playing cards by lamplight. Clara's visits continued, though less frequently as her own health began to fail. Reverend Pike aged but remained sharp, checking in weekly, bringing news and comfort. The community that had once ignored Martha's plight had become her support, making sure her final years were dignified and full. But in the spring of 1890, 7 years after Elias had first found the cabin, Martha took a turn. What had been a slow decline became something more urgent. She developed a cough that wouldn't leave, lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, spent more time in bed than out of it. The doctor from Copper Springs, a young man named Aldridge, had been frank with Elias. Her heart's wearing out. Weeks maybe. A month or 2 if she's strong and lucky. Elias had thanked him, paid him from his savings, and sat by Martha's bed through the long afternoon. When she woke, she'd looked at him with clear eyes. "I'm dying," she'd said. "Not a question." "Yes, Mom." "Good, I'm ready." She'd reached for his hand. "But there's something I need you to do first." "Anything." "Write to Thomas. Tell him I'm going. Give him a chance to come if he wants to." But Elias, she'd gripped his hand tighter. "Tell him I don't expect it. Tell him I forgive him either way. Tell him I died knowing he cared. That's what matters." Elias had written that night, a careful letter explaining Martha's condition, extending an invitation without pressure. He'd posted it express, paying extra for speed, though he doubted Thomas would come. The man had made his choice 7 years ago in Chicago. Nothing had changed since then. Days passed. Martha drifted in and out, sometimes lucid, sometimes confused. She called for people long dead, had conversations with ghosts. But in her clear moments, she was herself, gentle, forgiving, grateful for each breath. Elias barely left her side. He slept in the chair beside her bed, woke to every sound, held water to her lips when she could drink, and simply sat holding her hand when she couldn't. Clara came as often as she could, bringing soup Martha couldn't eat and prayers she could hear. Reverend Pike visited daily, reading from the Bible, offering comfort. The cabin was filled with quiet love in those final days, proof that Martha's life had mattered, that she would be mourned. 2 weeks after Elias had sent the letter, on a morning when Martha seemed slightly stronger, she'd asked him to help her to the porch. He'd wrapped her in blankets despite the spring warmth, settled her in her rocking chair, and sat beside her. "Tell me about him," she'd said. "About Thomas, when you saw him." "I want to picture him clearly." So Elias had described the house, the fine clothes, the confident bearing. He'd painted a picture of success and prosperity, leaving out the coldness, the fear, the calculation that had marked Thomas's choices. Martha deserved to imagine her son happy, and Elias would give her that gift. He looked well fed, she'd asked with a faint smile. "Very well fed, ma'am." "Good, I always worried he wasn't eating enough." She'd closed her eyes, the smile lingering. Thank you, Elias, for everything. For staying, for searching, for caring about a foolish old woman who should have known better than to wait for a son who wasn't coming back. You're not foolish, Elias had said. You're just a mother who loves her son. Nothing foolish about that. They'd sat in comfortable silence, listening to the wind in the cottonwoods, feeling the sun on their faces. And Elias had thought about the past 7 years, about how his life had changed from aimless drifting to purposeful staying. How Martha had given him back something he'd lost long ago, the sense that he mattered to someone, that his presence made a difference. That evening, after Clara had left and the light was fading, Martha had asked Reverend Pike to stay. "I want to make my will official," she'd said. While I still can, Pike had produced paper and pen, and Martha had dictated her wishes in a voice that was weak but clear. Everything to Elias, the cabin, the land, the small amount of money remaining in her account. Her Bible to Thomas, so he remembers where he came from, and a letter to be written to Thomas after her death, telling him she forgave him, that she died peacefully surrounded by love. "Read it back to me," she'd requested. Pike had read the document aloud, and Martha had nodded her approval. "That's right. That's how it should be." She'd looked at Elias with tears in her eyes. "You were the son I prayed for, the one who showed up when I needed him most. Miss Martha, don't argue. I know my Thomas is out there and I love him, but you're the one who stayed. You're the one who chose me. That means something. It means everything." She'd signed the will with a shaking hand, and Pike and Clara had witnessed it. Then Martha had asked to go back to bed, exhausted from the effort. That night had been hard. Martha's breathing grew labored, her pain evident despite her efforts to hide it. Elias had given her the laudanum the doctor had left, held her through the worst of it, and prayed for mercy. Just before dawn, she'd woken fully alert, her eyes bright with something like recognition. "Elias," she'd whispered, "I need to tell you something. About Thomas. About what I know. Save your strength. Listen." She'd gripped his hand with surprising force. "I always knew what you were doing. Those 2 years you were gone, you were searching for him. I knew." Elias had started to deny it, but she'd shaken her head. "I knew because Clara told me. She and Pike, they knew your plan from the beginning. They told me after you'd been gone a month. Thought I should know someone cared that much. Miss Martha, I let you search. I let you spend 2 years of your life on that quest because you needed to do it. Not for me, though you thought it was. For yourself. You needed to believe you could finish something, could keep a promise, could matter." Tears had slipped down her weathered cheeks. "And you did. You mattered more than you'll ever know." She'd been quiet for a moment, gathering strength. "But here's what I need you to understand. Thomas isn't wicked. He's just weak. He made choices he thought he had to make, and now he's trapped by them. Pride and fear, they're powerful chains. He abandoned you. He did. And I forgive him. Not because what he did was right, but because holding on to anger would only hurt me. Forgiveness is for the forgiver, Elias. Remember that. I'll try, and when I'm gone, I want you to write to him one more time. Tell him everything. Tell him about these last days. Tell him I died knowing he cared, that I forgave him, that I was happy at the end. Give him that peace, even if he doesn't deserve it. I will. Promise me. I promise." Martha had smiled then, a radiant expression that transformed her worn face. "Good, that's good." She'd closed her eyes. "I'm so tired, Elias, so very tired. Then rest. I'm right here. I know. You're always here." Her voice had faded to barely a whisper. "Thank you for that. Thank you for staying." Her breathing had gradually slowed, each breath coming further apart. Elias had held her hand, kept vigil, bore witness to her peaceful passing as morning light filled the cabin. She'd died as she'd lived her final years, surrounded by love, knowing she mattered, at peace with her choices and her sons. It was as good a death as anyone could hope for. By the time Clara arrived at mid-morning, summoned by some intuition, Martha was gone. Clara had wept, had helped Elias prepare the body, had sent word to town. Reverend Pike had arrived by afternoon, grief evident on his lined face. She was ready, Elias had said, his own tears finally falling. She was at peace. Then that's all we can ask for, Pike had replied. The funeral had been well attended. Martha, once forgotten and abandoned, had made an impression in her final years. Townspeople came to pay respects, to tell stories of her kindness, to mourn a woman who'd suffered much but forgiven more. They'd buried her on the hill beside Daisy, with a simple marker Elias had carved from cottonwood, Martha Greeley, beloved mother, she wasn't alone. At the burial, Clara had read from the Bible, Pike had offered prayers, and Elias had stood in silence, letting grief wash over him. He'd cared for Martha for 7 years, had made her his purpose, and now that purpose was gone. The emptiness felt vast. After everyone had left, Elias had remained at the graveside, looking down at the freshly turned earth. He'd thought about promises kept and journeys taken, about the strange path that had led him from that dust storm 7 years ago to this moment. I kept my word, he'd said to the grave. I stayed. I found him. I took care of you. And I'll keep the last promise too. Thomas will know the truth. The wind had carried his words away across the desert, and Elias had turned back toward the cabin. It was his now by legal right and earned truth. But it felt hollow without Martha's presence, without purpose beyond his own survival. That evening, he'd sat at the table with paper and pen, composing the letter he'd promised Martha he would write. He'd told Thomas everything, about Martha's final illness, her peaceful death, her last words of forgiveness. He'd included a copy of her will, the Bible passage she'd wanted him to have, and the final message she'd dictated. He'd also included something of his own, a full account of the money Samuel Hewitt had stolen, the justice that had been served, and Thomas's inadvertent role in exposing the theft. He'd wanted Thomas to know that his attempts at providing for his mother, however distant, had ultimately led to something good. At the end, Elias had written, "Your mother died believing you were happy and well. She forgave you for everything. She loved you until her last breath. I don't know if you deserve her forgiveness, but you have it anyway." That was the kind of woman she was. More grace than judgment, more love than anger. I hope someday you'll realize what you lost by staying away. I hope it haunts you in the quiet moments. And I hope, despite everything, that you find peace with your choices. He'd sealed the letter and mailed it the next day. He didn't expect a response. Thomas had made it clear in Chicago that he couldn't risk his carefully constructed life. Martha's death wouldn't change that, but Elias had kept his promise. He'd told Thomas the truth. Whatever the man did with that information was beyond Elias's control. Days turned to weeks. Spring gave way to summer. The cabin felt too large and too quiet. Elias found himself talking aloud sometimes, as if Martha could still hear him. He maintained the property, worked odd jobs in town, but his heart wasn't in it. Purpose had left with Martha's last breath, Clara noticed. She visited one afternoon, bringing food Elias didn't eat and concern he couldn't dismiss. "You need to decide what comes next," she'd said gently. "You're drifting again, only now you're drifting while standing still." "I made a promise," Elias had said. "I told her I'd stay. You stayed while she needed you. She doesn't need you anymore. She's at peace. But you need something, Elias. You need a reason to get up in the morning beyond grief and obligation. I don't know what that is. Then find it. Travel if you need to, or stay and build a new life here. But don't just exist. Martha wouldn't want that for you." Clara had been right, Elias knew. But knowing and doing were different things. He was 40 years old, worn down by hard years and hard choices. Starting over seemed beyond his strength. Then, 3 months after Martha's death, on a hot August afternoon, something unexpected happened. A young woman arrived at the cabin, leading a donkey that looked remarkably like Daisy must have in her youth. The woman was perhaps 20, dressed plainly but respectably, with Martha's eyes and Thomas's proud bearing. "Mr. Boone?" she'd asked. "I'm Elizabeth Greeley, Thomas and Victoria's daughter. My father sent me." Elias had stared at her, unable to speak. This was Thomas's child, Martha's granddaughter. The continuation of a family line Martha had thought ended with her. "May I come in?" Elizabeth had asked. "I have letters from my father, and something else." Something important. Elias had shown her inside, offered her water, tried to process this impossible development. Elizabeth had sat at the table, Martha's table, and pulled papers from her bag. "Father received your letter about grandmother's death," she'd begun. It affected him more deeply than he expected. He couldn't come himself, for reasons you understand. But he wanted to do something, to honor her memory in a way that mattered. She'd handed Elias a legal document. He's establishing a trust. Money set aside to help elderly people in this area who have no family, who might otherwise be abandoned or neglected. It's called the Martha Greeley Home Fund. He's asking you to administer it, to use it to prevent what almost happened to grandmother from happening to others. Elias had read the document in stunned silence. The trust was substantial, funded with $50,000, far more than Thomas had ever sent to Martha in her lifetime. It would generate income in perpetuity, could help dozens of people over the years. Why? He'd asked. Guilt, Elizabeth had said simply. And love, I think, though he struggles to show it. He told me about grandmother for the first time after your letter came. Told me everything. Mother was furious at first, then heartbroken that she'd never met her husband's mother. They've been in crisis for months. But this, at least, is something father can do. Something concrete. And you? Why did you come? Elizabeth had smiled sadly. Because I wanted to meet you. The man who cared for my grandmother when her own family wouldn't. I wanted to see where she lived, to understand what she went through. And I wanted to tell you that you gave our family a gift we didn't deserve. You gave us the truth. Whatever happens now between my parents, whatever choices they make, they're making them with open eyes. She'd stayed for 2 days, asking questions about Martha, listening to stories, weeping at the grave on the hill. And when she left, she'd hugged Elias with genuine warmth. "Thank you," she'd said, "for everything you did. Grandmother was lucky to have you." After she'd gone, Elias had sat with the trust documents, turning them over in his mind. This was it, the purpose Clara had said he needed. Not just surviving, but using Martha's story to help others. Making sure no one else died alone and forgotten if he could prevent it. It wouldn't bring Martha back. It wouldn't undo Thomas's failures or erase Elias's grief. But it was something. A way to honor Martha's memory, to turn her suffering into something meaningful. It was a new promise to keep. And this time, Elias knew exactly how to keep it. He would stay in Copper Springs. He would administer the Martha Greeley Home Fund. He would make sure that in this small corner of New Mexico territory, kindness would triumph over neglect, and no one would have to die alone. It was what Martha would have wanted. And it was, perhaps, what Elias had been searching for all along. Not just a purpose, but a legacy worth building. The cabin would remain his home. The grave on the hill would remind him why the work mattered. And somewhere in Chicago, Thomas Greeley would have to live with his choices, comforted only by the knowledge that he'd finally done something his mother would have been proud of. It wasn't redemption. But it was, perhaps, a start. The years that followed Martha's death transformed Elias Boone in ways he couldn't have predicted. The Martha Greeley Home Fund became more than just a trust to administer. It became his life's work, his redemption for all the years he'd spent drifting without purpose or connection. The first months were spent learning. Elias had to understand legal documents, financial management, the bureaucracy of charitable work. Reverend Pike became his teacher and partner, guiding him through the complexities. Clara offered practical wisdom about which families in the area needed help, who was too proud to ask but desperate nonetheless. The fund's first beneficiary was an 80-year-old former miner named Jacob Walsh, blind and living in a shack outside of town, with no family and no means. Elias had arranged for him to receive a monthly stipend, enough for food and firewood and the dignity of independence. The old man had wept when Elias explained the arrangement. "Why?" Walsh had asked. "Why would anyone do this for me?" "Because someone did it for someone else once," Elias had replied. "And she asked me to pass it forward." Word spread slowly but steadily. An elderly widow whose children had moved east and forgotten her. a disabled ranch hand, abandoned by the family he'd worked for 30 years. A woman in her 70s, her mind failing, who wandered the streets until Elias arranged for a caretaker. Each case was different, but the pattern was the same. People left behind, forgotten, abandoned to struggle alone. The fund couldn't fix everything. Sometimes Elias arrived too late, finding someone who died alone, despite his best efforts. Those failures haunted him, drove him to work harder, to cast his net wider. He began making regular rounds through the territory, visiting remote homesteads, checking on people others had given up on. The work was exhausting and often heartbreaking. But it was also deeply satisfying in ways Elias had never experienced. He was making a difference, preventing suffering, honoring Martha's memory with every person he helped. 3 years into administering the fund, in the autumn of 1893, Elias received an unexpected letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the return address made his heart stutter. Chicago. Inside was a letter from Thomas Greeley himself, the first direct communication since that night in the Gentlemen's Club 6 years ago. Elias had unfolded it with hands that trembled slightly, unsure what to expect. "Mr. Boone, I'm writing to inform you of changes in my circumstances that may affect the trust. More honestly, I'm writing because I owe you an explanation, perhaps an apology, though I know words are inadequate for the choices I've made. My daughter Elizabeth returned from visiting you transformed by the experience. She spoke of little else for months. My mother's grave, the cabin, your dedication to helping others in her name. Her passion affected my wife deeply. Victoria, who I'd kept in the dark about my origins for 15 years, demanded to know everything. The confrontation that followed nearly destroyed our marriage. But something unexpected happened. Victoria, rather than being disgusted by my humble background, was horrified that I'd abandoned my mother. Her family may be wealthy, but they are devoted to each other. She couldn't fathom how I could have left my mother alone, could have chosen social standing over family obligation. In her eyes, I became someone lesser, someone she couldn't respect. We are separated now. Not divorced, Victoria's faith won't allow it, but living apart. She keeps the house and the children. I've taken modest rooms downtown. I no longer work in finance. That world closed to me when word of the separation spread. I teach accounting now at a commercial college. The salary is a fraction of what I once made. You might think I'm writing for pity or sympathy. I'm not. I'm writing to tell you that I'm increasing the trust fund significantly. I'm liquidating my remaining assets and adding them to what I've already contributed. Another $75,000 will be transferred by the end of the year. It won't bring my mother back. It won't undo the years she spent alone because of my cowardice. But it will help others, and perhaps that's worth something. Perhaps it's the only worthy thing I've done in my entire privileged, wasted life. Elizabeth asks about you in her letters. She wants to return to Copper Springs, to see your work, to be part of the legacy her grandmother left behind. I'm not well enough to travel. My health has declined with my circumstances. But if you would welcome her, I would be grateful. You told me once that my mother's forgiveness should haunt me. It does, every day. The knowledge that she died still loving me, still hoping I was happy, while I lived in comfort, built on lies and abandonment. It's a weight I'll carry to my grave. I don't ask for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I only ask that you continue the work you've begun, that you make something good from the wreckage of my failures. Respectfully, Thomas J. Greeley. Elias had read the letter 3 times, trying to understand what he felt. Not satisfaction exactly, though there was a grim justice in Thomas's fall from grace. Not pity, though the man's circumstances were clearly reduced. Something more complex, a recognition that suffering didn't erase sin, but perhaps it could lead to growth, to better choices. He'd written back that evening, keeping his response brief but honest. Yes, Elizabeth would be welcome in Copper Springs. Yes, he would use the additional funds wisely. And yes, Martha's forgiveness was real, even if Thomas struggled to accept it. Forgiveness wasn't earned, it was given. That was what made it grace rather than justice. Elizabeth had arrived the following spring, now 23, and clearly searching for something her Chicago life couldn't provide. She'd brought money of her own, an inheritance from her maternal grandmother, and a proposal that startled Elias with its ambition. "I want to build something permanent," she'd said that first evening at the cabin. "Not just monthly stipends, but an actual home. A place where elderly people who have no one can live with dignity, can have community, can die surrounded by care rather than alone." "That would be expensive," Elias had cautioned. "More than we have, then we'll raise it. Father still has connections, people who feel guilty about how they treated him after the separation. If we frame it right, if we tell grandmother's story, people will give. Not just money, but time, labor, materials." She'd been right. Over the next 2 years, with Elizabeth's social skills and Elias's credibility, they'd raised funds from sources neither could have accessed alone. Wealthy families in Santa Fe looking for charitable causes. Church congregations moved by Martha's story. Even some of Thomas's former colleagues, perhaps hoping to assuage their own guilt through generosity. By the autumn of 1895, 12 years after Elias had first found Martha in that cold cabin, they'd broken ground on a new building at the edge of Copper Springs. Not large, just 12 rooms, but solid and well-designed. A place where elderly people without family could live, could eat together, could have medical care and companionship. They'd called it the Martha Greeley home. The construction had taken another year, with Elias overseeing the work personally. He'd insisted on quality over speed, on building something that would last. Clara had been his constant advisor, helping design spaces that would be comfortable and dignified. Reverend Pike had blessed the foundation stone and later the completed building. The home had opened in the spring of 1896, taking in its first 6 residents. Jacob Walsh, the blind miner, had been first through the doors, an elderly couple who'd lost their farm and had nowhere to go. 3 widows, each living alone in circumstances that ranged from difficult to desperate. Elias had hired staff, a cook, 2 caretakers, a part-time nurse. He'd established routines and rules that emphasized dignity and independence. Residents could keep their own belongings, could come and go as they pleased, could make decisions about their own lives. It wasn't charity in the degrading sense. It was support that allowed people to maintain their humanity. Elizabeth had stayed in Copper Springs, taking rooms in town and becoming the home's administrator. She and Elias worked together seamlessly, her organizational skills complementing his practical experience. They'd become friends, bonded by their shared mission and their connection to Martha. One evening, as they'd sat together reviewing applications from potential new residents, Elizabeth had asked the question Elias had been expecting for months. "Why did you do it? Why did you stay with my grandmother when you could have just moved on? You didn't know her, didn't owe her anything." Elias had been quiet for a long moment, considering how to explain something he didn't fully understand himself. "I'd been drifting for years," he'd finally said. "No home, no family, no purpose. Just moving from place to place, job to job, never mattering to anyone. Then I found your grandmother, and suddenly I did matter. I was the difference between her living and dying. That feeling, that sense of purpose, it was like water in the desert. I couldn't walk away from it, but you stayed for years. Long after she was stable, long after you could have left with a clear conscience. Because by then, she wasn't just my purpose. She was my family. The cabin was my home. I stayed because I wanted to, because I couldn't imagine being anywhere else." Elizabeth had smiled. "She was lucky to have you." "I was lucky to have her," Elias had corrected. "She gave me back my life, gave me a reason to matter. Everything that's happened since, everything we've built, it all traces back to that first night when I decided to stay instead of leaving come morning." As word of the Martha Greeley home spread, other communities had begun asking questions. Could they replicate the model? Could the fund support similar homes elsewhere? Elias and Elizabeth had discussed expansion, had begun planning cautiously, not wanting to overextend but recognizing the need was vast. By 1897, 14 years after finding Martha, Elias was 54 years old. His hair and beard had gone completely grey. His body ached with the accumulation of hard years. But his eyes held a light they'd never had in his drifting days, the light of purpose, of accomplishment, of a life lived in service to something larger than himself. The original cabin remained his home, though Elizabeth had urged him to take a room at the Martha Greeley home itself. "You should be comfortable," she'd argued. "You've earned rest." "I'm comfortable where I am," Elias had replied. "Besides, someone needs to maintain Martha's grave, keep the flowers fresh. That's easier from the cabin." He'd visited the grave every week, clearing weeds, replacing flowers, talking to Martha about the work being done in her name. Sometimes he talked to Daisy's grave as well, remembering the patient donkey who'd been his companion through so much. On the 14th anniversary of Martha's death, in the summer of 1897, Elias had received another letter from Thomas. This one was shorter, written in a shakier hand. "Mr. Boone, my health continues to decline. The doctor says perhaps 6 months, possibly less. My heart," he tells me, "though we both know it's more than my physical heart that's failing, I'm writing to ask a favor I have no right to request. When I die, would you allow me to be buried beside my mother? I know I don't deserve to rest near her, don't deserve any connection to her memory, but I'd like to spend eternity closer to her than I spent my life. If you refuse, I'll understand. The decision is yours. You're more her son than I ever was." Thomas J. Greeley Elias had sat with that letter for a long time, wrestling with complicated emotions. Part of him wanted to refuse, to tell Thomas that some failures couldn't be rectified, even in death. But another part, the part Martha had shaped and softened, remembered her words. "Forgiveness is for the forgiver." He'd written back, "When the time comes, you'll be buried beside your mother. Not because you've earned it, but because she would have wanted it." "She forgave you?" "I suppose I can do the same." Thomas had died 4 months later. Elizabeth had brought his body back to Copper Springs, accompanied by Victoria and the younger children, Thomas's sons, Martha's grandsons. It was a subdued group, marked by grief and regret in equal measure. They'd buried Thomas on the hill beside Martha and Daisy, with a marker that read simply, "Thomas J. Greeley, beloved son, forgiven." Victoria had stood at the grave for a long time after others had left, weeping quietly. Finally, she'd approached Elias. "Thank you," she'd said, "for letting him rest here, for not making him pay forever for his mistakes." "We all make mistakes," Elias had replied. "The measure of a person is whether they try to make amends." Thomas tried at the end. That counts for something. "He died still loving her," Victoria had said. "He just didn't know how to show it while he was living." "That's tragedy," Elias had agreed. "But it's human tragedy. We all struggle to love well." After Thomas's burial, Victoria had made a surprising announcement. She was establishing an additional trust, adding to what Thomas had already contributed. The Martha Greeley home would have permanent funding, enough to ensure it could operate in perpetuity and potentially expand to other communities. "It's what Thomas would have wanted," she'd said, "if he'd been brave enough to do it while he was alive." With that additional funding, the future of the home was secured. Elias and Elizabeth began making plans for expansion, for additional facilities, for reaching more people in need. And late at night, when Elias sat in the cabin that had been his home for 14 years, he thought about the strange path his life had taken, from aimless drifter to purposeful builder of something that would outlast him. From a man who belonged nowhere to a man who'd created belonging for others. It had all started with a simple choice on a storm-swept day, to stay instead of leaving, to care instead of passing by, to matter to one forgotten old woman in a remote cabin. That choice had changed everything. It had saved Martha, had transformed Elias, and had created a legacy that would help countless others. Sometimes the smallest decisions, Elias reflected, had the most profound consequences. Sometimes staying was harder than leaving, but infinitely more valuable. Sometimes one person's kindness could echo through generations. changing lives in ways that couldn't be measured or predicted. And sometimes, in the harsh country where mercy was scarce, a drifter and a donkey could save more than just one life. They could save the very idea that compassion mattered, that people were worth helping, that no one should have to die alone. Martha had taught him that. And now, through the home that bore her name, that lesson would be passed on to others, year after year, life after life. It was a legacy worth living for. And when his own time came, Elias knew he'd face death without regret, knowing he'd made the right choice all those years. A goat knowing he'd stayed. The 20th century's first decade brought changes that neither slowed nor deterred the work of the Martha Greeley home. By 1905, there were now 3 facilities operating across New Mexico territory, housing 78 residents in total. Elizabeth's vision of expansion had become reality, funded by Victoria's generosity and a growing network of donors who believed in the mission. But time was taking its toll on Elias. He was 62 now, his body bearing the accumulated damage of a lifetime of labor. His knees ached constantly, arthritis had gnarled his fingers, and his breathing grew labored with exertion. The doctor in Copper Springs had been frank. His heart was weakening, his body wearing out. He had perhaps a year, maybe 2, if he slowed down and rested. Elias had no intention of slowing down. He'd spent the spring of 1905 traveling between the 3 homes, checking on operations, visiting with residents, ensuring that the standards Martha would have wanted were being maintained. Each facility was different in character but unified in purpose, providing dignity and community to those who had no one else. In Santa Fe, he'd met a woman named Rosa Chavez, 91 years old, whose family had moved to California and simply stopped writing. She'd been living in a storage shed behind a church when the home staff found her. Now she had a clean room, regular meals, and friends who played cards with her every evening. "Why did you do this?" she'd asked Elias during his visit. "Build these places. You could have lived easy, could have kept that money for yourself." "I made a promise to someone," Elias had replied. "And keeping promises is the only thing that makes us more than animals." Rosa had nodded sagely. She must have been special, this person. She was. But she was also just a person, like you, like me. That's what made it matter. She was ordinary, and she deserved to be cared for anyway. The conversation had stayed with Elias as he'd traveled back to Copper Springs. Ordinary people deserving care. That was the heart of it, the core truth Martha had taught him. Everyone mattered. Everyone deserved dignity. No one should die alone and forgotten. It was late May when he'd returned to the cabin, exhausted from travel, but satisfied with what he'd seen. The homes were thriving. The work would continue long after he was gone. Elizabeth was fully capable of carrying it forward, and she had good people working with her. He'd sat on the porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the desert in familiar colors, and felt a deep sense of peace. Whatever time he had left, he would spend it here, in this place that had been home longer than anywhere else in his life. The next morning, he'd woken to find his left arm numb and his chest tight with pain. He'd recognized what was happening, his heart giving its first serious warning. He'd managed to get dressed, to make it to the porch, to sit in the chair where he and Martha had spent so many evenings. Clara had found him there an hour later, his face grey with pain, but his eyes alert. She'd immediately sent for the doctor and for Elizabeth, but Elias had known the truth before either arrived. This was the beginning of the end. The doctor confirmed it. "You've had a significant heart episode, Mr. Boone. You need complete rest, no exertion, no travel. Even then, your heart is badly damaged. Another episode could come at any time. How long?" Elias had asked. Impossible to say. Weeks, certainly. Months, possibly. But not years. Elizabeth had been devastated, had wanted to move him to the main home where he could have constant care. But Elias had refused. "This is where I belong," he'd said firmly. "This cabin, this land. Martha's here, up on that hill. When my time comes, I want to be looking at that hill, not at the inside of some facility. Then I'll arrange for someone to stay with you," Elizabeth had insisted. "You can't be alone." "I won't be," Elias had replied. though he wasn't entirely sure what he meant by that. The weeks that followed were strange, painful, but also oddly peaceful. Elias's body was failing, but his mind remained clear. He spent his days on the porch when weather permitted, in the chair by the fire when it didn't. Visitors came regularly, Elizabeth daily, Clara as often as her own failing health allowed. Residents from the home who wanted to thank the man who'd given them a place to belong. He'd also spent time writing, using the journal that had become his companion over the decades. He wrote about Martha, about the search for Thomas, about building the home and weathering the crisis with Richard Ashford. He wrote about what he'd learned, what he'd come to understand about kindness and purpose, and the ways one life could touch another. "These are my memories," he'd explained to Elizabeth when she'd asked what he was writing. "When I'm gone, maybe they'll help someone understand why this work matters, why staying is sometimes harder than leaving, but worth infinitely more." One evening in late June, as the summer heat settled heavy over the desert, Elias had asked Elizabeth to bring him something from the home's office, the original letter Thomas had written to Martha, the cold, formal letter that had hurt her so deeply all those years ago. He'd read it again, this formal distance that had characterized Thomas's abandonment. Then he'd pulled out the letter Thomas had written him from Chicago, the one where he'd confessed his guilt and increased the trust fund. 2 letters, years apart, showing the arc of a man's journey from cowardice to something approaching redemption. "People change," Elias had said to Elizabeth. "Not always enough, not always in time, but they change. Your father did. He never made it back to see his mother, but he tried to make amends in other ways. That counts for something. Do you forgive him?" Elizabeth had asked. "Truly?" Elias had thought about that for a long moment. "I don't know if forgiveness is mine to give. Your grandmother forgave him, and that's what matters. But I understand him better now than I did in that Chicago club all those years ago. Fear makes people do terrible things. So does pride. He was trapped by both. We're all trapped by something," Elizabeth had observed. "Yes, but some of us find our way out. Your father did eventually. And you found your way to something better than the life you were raised for. You chose purpose over comfort. That takes courage." Elizabeth had kissed his weathered cheek. "I learned that from you. July brought more weakness, more pain." Elias could no longer make the walk to Martha's grave, could barely move from chair to bed without assistance. But his spirits remained good. He'd lived longer than he had any right to expect, had accomplished more than he'd ever imagined. If death came now, he was ready. One afternoon, with Elizabeth sitting beside him reading from a newspaper, Elias had interrupted her. "There's something I need you to do for me," he'd said. "When I'm gone." "Don't talk like that. Listen. When I'm gone, I want to be buried up on that hill, between Martha and Daisy, and I want a marker that says, 'Elias Boone, he stayed.' That's all. Just those 3 words. Why those words? Because that's what mattered. Not the searching, not the building, not any of the rest. The staying, the choosing to be present, to care, to not pass by. Everything else came from that one decision Elizabeth had promised, tears streaming down her face. The end came on an August evening, as the sun was setting and the desert air was finally cooling from the day's heat. Elias had been drifting in and out of consciousness for hours, his breathing shallow and labored. Elizabeth sat beside him, holding his hand. Clara had come, despite her own frailty. Reverend Pike was there, offering prayers and comfort. As the light faded, Elias had opened his eyes one last time, looking toward the window that faced the hill where Martha was buried. "I kept my promise," he'd whispered, so softly they almost couldn't hear. "I stayed." And then, as peacefully as Martha had gone before him, Elias Boone's long journey ended. They'd buried him 3 days later on that hill, exactly where he'd requested. The funeral was attended by more than 200 people, residents from all 3 homes, townspeople from Copper Springs, benefactors from Santa Fe and beyond. People whose lives had been touched by Elias's work, by his example, by his simple decision to stay when he could have left. The marker Elizabeth had installed was exactly as he'd requested. Elias Boone, he stayed. Simple words. But they told the story of a life transformed, of a drifter who became a builder, of a lonely man who created community for others. They told the story of what one person could accomplish by simply choosing to care, to be present, to not pass by suffering when they could alleviate it. And they told the story of a promise kept, not just to Martha, but to everyone who would come after, everyone who would benefit from the legacy of kindness that began on a dust-swept day in 1883, when a cowboy and a donkey found an abandoned woman and chose to stay. The sun set that evening on 5 graves on the hill: Martha, who'd taught the lesson; Daisy, who'd been faithful companion; Thomas, who'd learned too late; Augustus Cole, who'd defended the truth; and now Elias, who'd stayed when leaving would have been easier. 5 lives, intersecting in ways none of them could have predicted, creating something that would endure long after they were gone. The Martha Greeley home continued. Elizabeth ran it for another 30 years, expanding to 7 facilities before her own death in 1935. Her children carried it forward after her, and their children after them. The model was replicated across the West, helping thousands upon thousands of elderly people who had nowhere else to turn. And on the hill above the cabin in Copper Springs, the 5 graves stood as testament to a simple truth: kindness echoes through generations. One good deed ripples outward in ways that cannot be measured. And sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply stay when everything in them wants to leave. Martha had needed someone to stay. Elias had chosen to be that person, and in that choice, both their lives and countless others had been transformed. It was a legacy worth leaving, a story worth remembering, a truth worth teaching to each new generation. In a world that often passes by suffering, in a time when the vulnerable are easily forgotten, the simple act of staying, of caring, of being present, can change everything. That was Martha's lesson. That was Elias's gift. And that was the story that would endure long after all of them had returned to dust, long after the graves had weathered and the markers had worn, long after the names themselves had been forgotten. The lesson remained: stay, care, don't pass by. That's all. And that's everything. 10 years had passed since Elias Boone's death, and the world had changed in ways he could never have imagined. Automobiles puttered through Copper Springs now, sharing dusty roads with horses and wagons. Telegraph lines connected even remote corners of New Mexico territory to the wider world. The old century's rhythms were giving way to something faster, louder, more urgent. But on the hill above the old cabin, time moved differently. The 5 graves stood unchanged, markers weathered but still legible, testaments to lives that had intersected and transformed each other in ways both small and profound. It was on a cold November morning in 1915 that a stranger rode into Copper Springs on horseback, leading a young donkey on a halter. He was well dressed in the manner of eastern cities, his coat fine wool, his boots expensive leather. But there was something familiar in his bearing, in the shape of his face, in the way he carried himself. The stranger had gone first to the church, where an aging Reverend Pike still kept his office. The conversation had been brief, and afterward Pike had directed the man to the cabin. The cabin still stood, maintained now by the Martha Greeley home as a sort of museum and meeting space. The structure had been carefully preserved, looking much as it had in Elias's day. Fresh flowers stood in a vase on the table. Elizabeth's doing, Pike knew. Her weekly ritual of honor. The stranger had tied his horse and the donkey to the porch rail, then stood for a long moment looking at the building. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the door. Inside, everything was as it had been. The table where Elias and Martha had shared meals, the rocking chair where Martha had spent her final days, the simple furnishings that spoke of lives lived without pretension or excess. And on the table, carefully preserved under glass, lay several items: Martha's Bible, the photograph of Thomas as a young man, and Elias's journal. The stranger had picked up the journal with reverent hands, opened it to the first page, where Elias had written in his careful, Unpracticed script. This is the story of how I found a woman who needed help, and how helping her gave me back my life. He'd read for hours, sitting in Martha's chair, tears streaming down his weathered face as he absorbed the full story of what Elias had done, of the search that had consumed 2 years, of the confrontation in Chicago, of everything that had come after, when Elizabeth had arrived in the late afternoon for her weekly visit. She'd found the stranger still sitting there, the journal closed on his lap, staring at nothing. "Can I help you?" she'd asked gently. The man had looked up, and Elizabeth had gasped. She knew that face. She'd seen it in photographs, in her own mirror, in her children's features. "Uncle William," she'd whispered. "Thomas and Victoria's younger son." "Yes," William Ashford Greeley had confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. "I came to see where it all happened, where my father failed, and where Elias Boone succeeded." They talked as the afternoon light faded, William explaining that he'd only recently learned the full story. His mother, Victoria, had died the previous year, and among her effects he'd found letters, correspondence between her and Elizabeth that revealed everything. The abandonment of Martha, Thomas's guilt-driven attempts at restitution, Elias's extraordinary devotion. "My father never spoke of any of this," William had said. "He died when I was young, and I grew up thinking my paternal grandmother had died before I was born. Mother kept his secrets, protected his reputation, but she also kept these letters and a note for me to read after her death. She wanted me to know the truth." "Why did you come?" Elizabeth had asked. "Because I needed to understand, needed to see this place, to read Elias's words, to comprehend what my father threw away and what Elias built from the wreckage." He'd gestured to the journal. "This man, this drifter with barely any education, he understood something my father never did, that family isn't just blood. It's choice. It's staying when you could leave. It's caring when it would be easier not to." They'd walked up to the hill then, William moving slowly, reverently, to stand before the 5 graves. He'd spent the longest time at Martha's marker, reading the simple inscription over and over. She wasn't alone. She should have been surrounded by family, William had said. By her son, her grandchildren. We should have known her. But my father's pride and fear stole that from all of us. "Your father tried to make amends," Elizabeth had offered gently. "In his way, too little, too late, and done from a distance, where it was safe." William had shaken his head. But Elias, he gave up 2 years of his life searching for a man he'd never met, for a woman who wasn't even his mother. That's love, real love, the kind that costs something. He'd moved to Elias's grave then, reading the marker. "He stayed." 2 words that contain everything, William had murmured. The whole story, the whole lesson in 2 words. He stayed. They'd stood in silence for a long moment, the November wind moving through the cottonwoods that had grown tall in the decades since Martha's death. Finally, William had spoken again. "I brought something. I hope it's appropriate." He'd walked back down to the cabin and returned leading the young donkey, a grey female with patient brown eyes and gentle disposition. "This is Daisy," he'd said. "Named for the original. I bought her from a rancher in Colorado, brought her all the way here. I thought she should live here, at the cabin, as a living reminder of what the first Daisy and Elias did. Elizabeth, would the home be willing to care for her?" Elizabeth had smiled through tears. "Of course. We'll keep her here, let her graze on the hill. The residents can visit her, can pet her, can remember the story." "Good, that's good." William had stroked the donkey's soft nose. "Animals remember things we forget. Maybe having a Daisy here will help keep the story alive." Before William had left Copper Springs the next day, he'd done one more thing. He'd added substantially to the Martha Greeley Home Trust, money from his own inheritance that had come through Victoria. "My father's money," he'd explained. "Or my mother's family's money, really. Either way, it should have gone to Martha in the first place. I'm just correcting an old wrong." He'd also left instructions that a small plaque be placed at the cabin, telling the full story. Martha's abandonment, Elias's devotion, the search for Thomas, the founding of the homes. "People should know," he'd said. "Not just that the homes exist, but why they exist. The story matters as much as the buildings." Elizabeth had watched him ride away, this grandson Martha had never met, who'd been moved enough by her story to travel across the country to pay respects to a grandmother he'd never known and a man who'd loved her better than her own son had. The years that followed saw the Martha Greeley home continue to grow and evolve. New facilities opened, old ones expanded, the model spread to other states. By the 1930s, there were Martha Greeley homes across the West, each one maintaining the principles Elias and Elizabeth had established: dignity, community, care without condescension. The cabin became a pilgrimage site of sorts. People came to see where it all began, to read Elias's journal, to visit the graves on the hill. Some came out of curiosity, some for inspiration, some because they'd been helped by the homes and wanted to understand their origins. And always, there was a Daisy. When William's Daisy died in 1928, another took her place, and then another after that. The tradition became part of the story, a living link to that first Daisy who'd been companion to both Martha and Elias, whose patient presence had helped heal an old woman's loneliness. Elizabeth ran the organization until her own death in 1935 at the age of 62. She was buried on the hill, the sixth grave, with a marker that read, Elizabeth Crawford. She carried it forward. Her children and grandchildren continued the work after her, each generation adding its own innovations while maintaining the core mission. The Great Depression brought unprecedented need, and the Martha Greeley homes responded by expanding their services. The Second World War saw facilities opened specifically for elderly veterans who'd returned home to find their families gone or scattered. Each era brought new challenges, new populations in need, and the homes adapted while staying true to Martha and Elias's example. By the time New Mexico achieved statehood and then celebrated its centennial, the Martha Greeley home system had helped more than 50,000 people. 50,000 lives touched by a legacy that began with one cowboy's decision to stay with one abandoned woman on one dust-swept day in 1883. The cabin still stands today, preserved and protected, a historic site that tells a story of compassion in hard times. Visitors can see Martha's Bible, read Elias's journal, look at the photograph of Thomas that started everything. They can walk up the hill to the graves, can see where the story's key players rest together, their conflicts resolved by death and time, and they can meet the current Daisy, great-great-great-granddaughter of the original, who still grazes on that hill and nuzzles visitors with the same patient gentleness her ancestor showed Martha all those years ago. The story has been told and retold, in books and articles, in school lessons and church sermons. It's become myth and legend and inspiration, proof that one person's kindness can echo through generations, that choosing to stay and care and not pass by can change the world, in ways both large and small. Sometimes people ask what would have happened if Elias had kept riding that September day in 1883, if he'd found different shelter, or no shelter at all. If he'd discovered the cabin empty, Martha already dead from neglect. If he'd simply decided one old woman's survival wasn't worth his time or trouble. The answer is clear. Martha would have died alone and unmourned. Thomas would have lived and died with his secrets intact. The homes would never have existed. 50,000 people would have faced their final years without the dignity and community those homes provided. One choice, one decision to stay instead of leaving. That's all it took to change everything. That's the lesson Martha taught and Elias learned and generations have carried forward. In a world that often passes by suffering, that frequently forgets the vulnerable, that sometimes values efficiency over compassion, the simple act of staying, of caring, of being present, matters more than we can measure. Every person has worth. Every life has value. No one should have to die alone. These truths, self-evident to Martha and Elias, are the foundation on which the homes were built and continue to operate. And on a hill in southern New Mexico, beneath cottonwoods that have grown tall and strong, 6 graves stand testament to these truths. Martha, who endured; Daisy, who comforted; Thomas, who learned too late, Augustus, who defended, Elias, who stayed, and Elizabeth, who carried it forward. Their bones rest together in the earth they loved, their markers weathered by wind and time, their names still legible to those who make the pilgrimage to remember. And when the wind moves through the cottonwoods, when the desert light paints the landscape in shades of copper and gold, when the current daisy stands on that hill looking out over the valley, it's as if the spirits of those who came before are still present, still watching, still reminding each new generation of the lesson that matters most. Stay, care, don't pass by. Love costs something, but it's worth everything. This is the way. This has always been the way. This is the truth that endures when all else fades. On the table in the cabin, Elias's journal lies open to the final page, where he wrote in his careful script just days before his death, "I was a drifter with no home and no purpose. Martha gave me both. In return, I gave her my presence, my care, my promise to stay. It was the best trade I ever made. When I'm gone, I hope someone will read this and understand. The staying is what matters. Everything else is just details. The staying is what matters." 3 decades have passed since those words were written, but they remain as true today as they were then. And they will remain true tomorrow and the day after, and in all the tomorrows yet to come, because some truths don't change. Some lessons don't fade. Some stories deserve to be told and retold, generation after generation, until everyone understands. A lonely cowboy and a faithful donkey once found an abandoned old woman and chose to stay. From that simple choice, grace flowed outward like water in the desert, bringing life where there had been death, hope where there had been despair, community where there had been loneliness. And decades later, when a stranger returned to find a simple grave and a waiting donkey and a letter that told the whole truth, he understood what perhaps Thomas Greeley never quite grasped. The greatest inheritance isn't money or property or social standing. It's the legacy of kindness we leave behind, the lives we touch, the example we set for those who come after. Martha left that legacy through her forgiveness. Elias left it through his devotion. And now it lives on in the homes that bear Martha's name, in the thousands of people who've been helped, in the donkeys that graze on that hill, and in the hearts of everyone who hears the story and understands. Sometimes the kindest souls are the ones the world overlooks, and the greatest acts of love are the ones no one ever sees, but they matter. They echo, they endure, just like Martha, just like Elias, just like that one choice to stay forever.